Hello everyone. In this presentation we are going to look at how to teach reading to primary children between the ages of 5 to 6 to 10 years old. We'll also look at what demands does reading put on young children and what are the methods which we can use to teach early literacy, and we'll also see how important it is to choose appropriate reading materials. So reading is very demanding for a very young reader. Imagine a 5 to 6 years old who is still learning to read in L1. How difficult would it be for that particular young learner to develop reading skills in an L2? And L1 could be very different from his L2. So for example, Roman alphabet which are similar, for example in French and English, but they are totally different. For example, in French you mostly don't pronounce ending consonants, but in English you do. Likewise, Chinese and Arabic scripts are totally different. In our case, English and Urdu scripts are also different, so that puts a lot of demand on our students to learn English. As well as the young learner has a limited knowledge of the world, so all these things make it very difficult for children to learn to read in English. And that makes a teacher wonder, what approach should the teacher take? Should L2 reading instruction take place alongside L1 instruction, or should they be started when the young children have already learned how to read in their L1? So these sorts of debates are pretty common, but we are going to stick with our context in which we teach L1 and L2 together. So what are the challenges faced by young L2 learners? They could be different according to their age groups. If they are very young learners of 4 to 6, so their challenges are going to be different. And if they are a little older, say 7 to 10 years old, their challenges are going to be different. And of course, it's going to be dependent on our context, whether children are going to public school or private school, if they have anyone who can support their L2 reading at home, if their parents are literate or illiterate. So these all things will eventually have an impact on our approach to L2 reading with young children. This table points out at the similarities and differences in first and second language reading, and this also makes us think about the cognitive load which we are putting on these children. So everyone reading needs to have an understanding of alphabetic system of that language. They need to have decoding skills, which mean they should be able to sound out what's written. To be able to read at any speed, they need to read the vocabulary almost automatically. They should have overall fluency. They need to develop some metacognitive strategies, for example, some sort of planning, what to read and how to read it. The text should be matched to the reading level and interest of the readers, because if the text is beyond the reading level of the readers, it's going to create a lot of problem and the readers won't be able to understand it. One of the requirements for first and second language readers is also to engage in extensive reading, which means reading a lot. Some of the challenges which only second language readers face are sound symbol dissimilarities. So for example, in English, the alphabet A can be pronounced differently in different words. For example, A in father is pronounced differently than A in fan. Oral vocabulary constraints. Second language learners do not have enough vocabulary to be able to understand what's written. They have limitations due to background knowledge, so the pictures may not help a lot because they cannot relate to it. It's from different culture. They also have difficulty with text structure because they could have different text structures in their first language, and English could have different text structures. So all these unique challenges make reading process very demanding, especially for young children. So we have to start with oral language proficiency. A learner, especially a very young learner who is starting to learn to read, she must be able to speak that language to a certain extent in order to start to learn to read. According to one estimate by Laufer, a minimum of 90% of the vocabulary in the text must be familiar. So this does not allow so many new words at one time. And this vocabulary development should be purposeful, not incidental acquisition like in L1. Remember, in L1, a child has a lot of time to pick up vocabulary, but when in case of L2, the learner may not have a lot of time, so we need to develop this vocabulary purposefully. At this point, I'd like you to pause and think how you might approach early vocabulary recognition. Let's see how we can approach this early vocabulary recognition. Caroline Lynn says, hear a word before you can say it, which means listening before we can speak it. Say a word before you can read it, which means speaking before we can read it, and reading a word before you can write it. So, which means a child needs to be able to listen to that word in order to speak it, and once the child is able to speak it and relate it to something, the child will be able to read it. And for reading, of course, the child needs to have decoding skills, so that is quite a lot of things. So a child needs to know the phonemes, which means all the sounds. So a child should be aware of all the sounds, and then the alphabets, and then of course how these alphabets correspond to those sounds. So for example, if it's written FAN, so how these three FAN sound like. So they need to know what's the sound of alphabet F, what's the sound of alphabet A, what's the sound of alphabet N, to be able to say that word. And of course the learner needs to understand the meaning of that word in order to recognize that vocabulary. So for each word, the child has to have a lot of knowledge that makes it very, very difficult to teach them. Now let's see how we can approach the alphabetic instruction. Alphabetic instruction means teaching children letter sound correspondences and of course their meaning of the words. So according to the research, L2 learners benefit from explicit alphabetic instruction. So that's why we should teach them how words work and how alphabetic system works. Say, remember that these symbols were invented to pass on information, so they are man-made, they are not natural. Many different ways were invented. For example, ancient Egyptian symbols, Chinese pictographs, Arabic text is different, Roman text is different. They are not just different in symbols, but also in directionality. So Urdu starts from right to left, but English starts from left to right. So these all things need to be taught explicitly because these are man-made. They are not natural that children are going to pick up automatically. So we need to teach them explicitly. Now let's begin to think how to approach reading. So there are three orientations to approach reading. The first one is top down, which means that a lot of context is given to the students and they are taught how to read the whole text holistically. They are not going to read each and every word and try to understand. They are going to make sense of it through the pictures which are given on the page and so on. But this requires careful choice of topic and they need to have a clear purpose for reading. Second orientation is interactive, where the teacher and the child work together. It's a kind of social activity, and of course which means that the teacher is scaffolding the child to be able to read, and that takes away a lot of pressure off the student. The last orientation is bottom up, which was perhaps the only orientation which was used in the past. Um, According to it, students learn to read syllables, morphemes, then word, and then they try to convert it into a sentence. But sentences can be very difficult for children if they are processing each and every word in a sentence while reading, because they could come across grammar patterns which are new and difficult for them to make the meaning of. But individual word recognition could be a good start, given the fact that many words are new in L2. So we can use bottom-up orientation in order to help students recognize the new words in L2. Now let's look at some of the ways in which we can teach reading skills to young learners. One of the most popular and arguably the most effective way to teach English reading skills is called phonics. Phonics is a system that helps us understand how words are formed. Words are built out of small units of sounds, and they are called phonemes, and therefore this approach is called phonics, taken out from this word phonemes. Phonics is the connection of these sounds with the letter symbols. So for example, if we have a letter that we call A, and it could produce multiple sounds in a word. So for example, in the word fan, this alphabet A produces a sound as in fan, and the same alphabet A produces a sound in father. So these letter sound correspondence is called phonics. This is what we teach through this method. Using this system of learning enables fluent reading and writing. So for example, if you take the word frog, although it consists of a single syllable, it contains four different phonemes. They are f, r, o, g, and together it produces frog. As we know that there are only 26 alphabets in English, but in total they produce 44 sounds, and these 44 sounds are formed not only by single alphabets but also digraphs. Digraphs are combinations of letters that make new sounds such as sh and ch. 44 letter sounds are broken down into different sections, and they increase in difficulty as the child progresses. Blending is a vital tool to develop fluent reading, so the child is taught to merge the various letter sounds that form a particular word until they can hear and recognize the word. Taking the same example of frog, once the child is able to produce these four sounds, f, r, o, g, we teach them how to blend it. Blending means just saying it together, merge all these sounds to produce a single word. So we'll teach the child to produce it like this: frog, frog, frog. So this is how the teacher enables the child to produce the whole word. They can start to practice this skill as soon as they have learned the first three sounds. So normally first three sounds which are taught are s, at. So they are able to blend these sounds together to make sad, and then cat, and then fat, and so on. So in phonics instruction, we teach first of all initial consonants like k, b, d, then consonant blends, Interestingly, blends are basically two sounds combined together by two different alphabets, but these two alphabets come together in reading a lot of times, so that's why we teach them together rather than separately. So blends can be bil, tl, fl, etc. Then we teach consonant digraphs like ch, sh, etc. and then the vowel sounds. At this stage, I'd like you to go on to this link and explore how phonics instruction work by reading some of the basic information given on this site and watch the videos which are given on this site so that you understand how these phonics instructions work. Another bottom-up approach to teaching reading is called look and say. In this approach, children are shown whole words together and they say it, and this is how they recognize the words rather than breaking down the words into its parts like we have seen in the phonics method. Numerous words in English language are not phonetically regular and cannot be learned using a solely phonetic approach. So that's why we use look and say approach, in which we show a lot of words to students and they recognize it through patterns. Over time, children build up a larger vocabulary of whole words which they can recognize and infer others as they learn affixes. As they grow up, they learn suffixes, prefixes, and this is how they learn the whole um, science of words, and they start recognizing those words which they have not looked at and memorized the pronunciation of. An interesting approach to teaching reading is the blend of phonics and look and say approaches. It is called the mixed approach. Phonics is clearly important and gives a good base. However, look and say allows a child to read simple books much more quickly without going into the details of how the alphabetic code works. They may deduce many of the sounds from seeing the same sounds matching the same letters or combinations in look and say approach. So teaching some whole words while also teaching phonics gives a wider range of vocabulary for more interesting reading. So we can also use this approach by blending both the approaches and take advantage from both of them. Other ways of reading could be big book technique, which we are going to explore in the following slides. Songs and rhymes could also be an important source for reading. We can provide the transcripts of them while students listen to songs and rhymes. Paired reading is also very popular with young children. Reading aloud is another technique, and of course for older learners we can use silent reading. They read silently and the focus is on comprehension. Research shows that there is a strong link between reading success in a school and early reading experiences at home. Another researcher, Ellington, found that the good readers were the ones who were read to at home. So there was someone who was reading to those children at home, for example, a grandmother, grandfather, or parents. Shared reading between parent and child seems to be the foundation for early literacy, and the big book approach is an extension of this concept into the classroom. So the big book technique uses enlarged texts and allow all the children in the classroom to see and react to the words and pictures on the page as the teacher reads aloud to them. This is similar to shared reading between a parent and a child. The big book approach is the closest approximation that can be offered in the classroom to family storybook readings, and this is how we are capitalizing on what students are already familiar with. So what about the comprehension in these approaches? For very young learners, this is just matching the pictures with the words. This is also considered as comprehension. They can also point to the words, pictures while they are being read to, and they can also react, and this could be considered as their comprehension. As the children get a little older, maybe 7 to 10 years old, they can now read in their L1. They are also familiar with Roman alphabet and English sounds, but still there are some challenges which we need to address. We need to combine top-down and bottom-up approaches to facilitate their comprehension. Still, there may be lack of cultural familiarity, which means maybe images are not helpful for predicting the story in the storybooks. They are still acquiring L1 and L2 vocabulary, which could hinder their comprehension. One very important consideration is choosing reading materials for young learners. You will see course books, they are arranged in pre-reading, while reading and post-reading tasks, which is very beneficial organization for developing any of the skills in L2. We should choose relevant texts which are interesting for young learners, and the most important thing is that they should be at the appropriate level. 90% of the vocabulary should be known to students when they are reading a text in order to comprehend that. If there are so many words which they cannot understand, then they won't be able to comprehend the whole text. I would like you to go on to this website and see some of the reading skills texts which are designed, and see how they can help students in developing their reading ability. So the reading materials should move from individual words to sentences, then sentences to short texts. Reading should also be a part of other learning activities like role play, instructions to follow, stories which we are reading to them. Maybe they can have a look at the book. In case of big book technique, they can also look at the words which the teacher is reading to them. Graded readers are very useful for a little older readers, and we can also integrate plays. They can perform the plays and read the script, the simple form of scripts. At this stage, I'd like you to pause for a thought and choose one of these activities and evaluate how it helps in developing reading skills. Moving on to the conclusions, very young learners are learning to read L1 and L2 simultaneously, so we need to address the challenges this brings up. Oral language proficiency is needed to start reading, and this would be unfair for children to read out something which they cannot understand. Careful choice of reading materials can really help producing effective and efficient readers. For exploring this topic further, I'd like you to complete the reading and answer the questions which are given in the task sheet, so that you can reflect on different ideas related to teaching reading to primary school children.